All right, hello everybody. So thank you so much for taking the time to be with me today. And I want to thank my advisory committee, especially Melanie, but also my two other committee members, Jackie Gonzalez, who's an environmental historian, and Todd Lookingbill, who's a landscape ecologist, who were essential in creating this interdisciplinary thesis. I also want to thank other faculty members, my co-students, my husband, Rob, who's here today, my other family members, our cats, Leo and Luna, and all the other non-human species that I've come into contact with throughout my life. It's a lot. So let's talk about bison. Probably not something you thought you'd hear today. So some of you may or may not know that the National Bison Legacy Act was passed in 2016. So the American bison was established as our national mammal, which recognizes their ecological, historical, and cultural role in grassland habitat health, the ties to Native American history, colonialism, and conservation throughout the 1800s. So the bison joined ranks of the bald eagle as a recognizable cultural symbol, and it's, I think, a logical place to start when speaking about culturally significant species because they are so iconic. And with this act in mind, I began thinking about how we have other lists and programs to protect species in our country. So we have threatened and endangered species list, there's state birds, state plants. I didn't know there's also a state mammal list. There's heritage trees programs, but there's no central or standardized concept to identify culturally significant species. So this is the focus of my thesis, to come up with such a framework within preservation. And so my solution is twofold. So it's that historic preservation should play a role in cultural species identification and documentation. But I also think in order to do this, the preservation practice must expand to include non-human species. And I'm primarily thinking and talking about non-human animals here because I think vegetation already has a place within preservation. There's trees on the National Register and other types of vegetation as well. So ultimately, I propose a heritage species concept. So species meaning non-human animals, plants, and fungi even. So I propose this living species first approach, which expands the National Trust vision of a people's first approach to preservation, which actually was a suggestion from Betsy early on in this thesis process. And the overall goal here of this concept is to document species, people, and places, but also manage those places, manage cultural landscapes holistically as a system. And I think on a larger scale, even outside of preservation, this way of thinking about species and the environment on the same level of people can help overcome the inherent human exceptionalism that Western society tends to have when considering non-human-human relationships. So my framework of heritage species integrates with the cultural landscape methodology, so it's helpful to know what a cultural landscape is. So what are they? So the definition here, this is the National Park Service definition, and so cultural landscape is basically an area with cultural and natural resources. But it's important to note that their own definition includes wildlife or domestic animals therein. And this is a definition that's been around since the 1980s when the Park Service began integrating cultural landscapes into how they manage their park systems like they do today. The NPS uses cultural landscape inventories and cultural landscapes reports to manage park systems. So the inventories assess current conditions and impacts, whereas the reports focus more on landscape treatment. And these reports also follow the National Register, National Historic Preservation Act framework. So they identify contributing resources that are eligible for the National Register within these reports, including things like vegetation. And it's important to also note that cultural landscapes are not just used by the National Park Service, although I will be talking about them a lot today. They're also used by other agencies like municipalities that document and manage historic cemeteries or parks, for example. And an important aspect of the NPS methodology to cultural landscapes is the use of these 13 landscape characteristics shown here, which contribute to a landscape's historic character and help us sort of break down the overall landscape as a whole to better understand it. So these range from things like cluster arrangement to views and vistas to vegetation. So my question really here was, when I saw this, like, where are the wildlife and domestic species that are literally within their own definition? Where do the non-human animals fit in? And here are some cute little photos of non-human animals. So there are many discussions related to this topic of humans and non-humans, of nature versus culture. There are a lot of different environmental histories that I've read that focus on wildlife within the United States, like black bears, bison, whooping cranes, coyotes. More specifically, within preservation, the nature-culture divide is a discussion of how to deal with living landscapes within a preservation framework meant for the built environment, which we've already talked about today in terms of climate change and how that's impacting our landscapes. A lot of these discussions of nature versus culture tend to focus on land management and consultation, not so much documentation. Another important discussion is adding nature as a lens to view landscapes and understand landscapes, which is also discussed by historians working in the field of preservation, who argue that nature is not just a stage that culture plays out on, but it's in fact an actor itself that has dictated what our landscapes look like today, like where we've built our roads or what we've built our houses out of. And more specific to this thesis is that there's several scholars like Tom King and Laura Watts who talk about how to protect species under the National Historic Preservation Act and how to fit living species into the National Register framework. And lastly, I came across an animal history book recently that talks about binaries of human, non-human relationships. So wild, domestic, pet, livestock, human, animal. Here is a photo, I don't know if you can really see it, but of a wild domestic binary, like the great domestic black cat here, watching a gray eastern squirrel on YouTube, which our cat loves. But I think these binaries and categories of non-human species are found within our documentation, meaning National Register nominations and cultural landscape studies. So essentially, I think we should recalibrate our thinking to reconsider the separateness of humans versus non-humans in Western society within our documentation and preservation practice. So with that, let's finally talk about my actual concept. And I did not create this concept out of thin air. So the base of this concept was informed by two existing frameworks. So we have cultural keystone species on the left, which is a term within the field of ethnobiology, which studies human, non-human relationships, which was coined in 2004. And it was proposed to be parallel to the ecological term of keystone species. And that definition is defined as animal and plant species essential for a group's sustainability over time, species that are cultural icons but not necessarily ecologically crucial. And an example is this really small photo of me next to the largest Sitka spruce in the world, purportedly, in Olympic National Park. And researchers proposed a set of criteria and definitions, and the use of cultural keystone species as a concept and the best methodology to identify such species has been debated within the field of ethnobiology over the last 20 years. So this is a great framework, but it can't exactly be adopted into preservation for several reasons. One being that it's not a framework intended to identify species of historical significance per se. So we also have World Heritage Species. So this is a concept proposed in 2001 on the UNESCO World Heritage stage, and it was originally proposed to protect great apes, but it expanded to include other species like tigers or elephants and other charismatic species. And in 2008, a law professor from the US proposed criteria and a process for listing such species, which required a tangible conservation plan to go along with it. So ultimately, UNESCO was kind of like, no, we don't need this. The World Heritage Sites do enough, and so it really hasn't gained much movement within the World Heritage stage, but nonetheless, these are my 2 building blocks for heritage species, and I was actually quite surprised to find even 2 frameworks that kind of already set these criteria out for me to build upon. So the definition I propose, and I know there's a lot of words up here, but the definition I propose is a non-human species of cultural importance to a community that historically or currently contributes to a cultural landscape or community sense of place, culture, identity, or ecology. And I propose a set of 8 criteria, this is very historic preservation-y, to be inclusive of any type of non-human plant, animal, fungal species, ranging from species that contribute to a landscape's sense of place, like birds along a scenic trail, or other criteria linked to a community's shared identity, cultural or ecological sustainability, agricultural use, or significant historical event. And the idea is to use the criteria to help organize and think about species within a landscape. And I think obviously there should also be a strong community involvement part of this to help identify these species. It shouldn't be a top-down. We don't want to replicate past histories with preservation. And I don't think that this definition or criteria are perfect, which is why I'm not going to read through all the specific criteria. But the purpose was, okay, this is a starting off point because no one else has proposed this yet. And I think from here, the main question is, how do we integrate heritage species as living species into the National Register framework that was built for buildings? Because obviously this concept as a standalone doesn't really do much other than help us sort out our species and come up with some documentation. But I really want to integrate this within preservation to take it a step further. So, fitting living species into the National Register framework. So many of us here today know that fitting something into the National Register framework means that we need to consider several different aspects. And I think some of these are easier than others, and I don't have time to go through every detail here, so I'm happy to talk more about it after. But some easier aspects, I think, include, like criteria A, B, C, or D, and areas of significance. I think you could see how a species like an osprey depicted here, living in a protected wildlife refuge established in the 60s, could be listed under criteria in the area of conservation related to the historic environmental movement. But harder aspects include categorizing a species into a property type. So building, site, structure, or object. If we're thinking about contributing resources, they would need to be sorted this way. So Tom King and Laura Watts, who I mentioned before, already have started this conversation, and they posit that it could be technically considered an object, like a tree can. And they cite at least one legal court case of an example where the courts decided an animal could be considered an object under the National Historic Preservation Act. I am less thrilled about calling an animal an object. I advocate for non-human animals to be considered as part of their habitat or landscape, more as like a character-defining feature. But I think object works for vegetation like historic trees, and trees have already been listed. And Tom King also is like, well, technically a bird's a structure, right? There's like bones and feathers. And I think that takes it a little bit far, and I'm sure a state SHPO would be like, no, I think baby steps, and that's a little bit too far. So, but another question is age. So under criteria consideration, G for properties achieving significance under 50 years, many species don't live longer than 50 years. So if you were even thinking about listing a species to the National Register, you'd have to apply criteria consideration G. So osprey live until their 20s, but actually Melanie suggested that perhaps a species, I'm going to put this on you, perhaps a species that's been associated with the same place for over 50 years and keeps coming back, like I'm thinking like osprey, nesting species like green sea turtles that actually do live over 50 years, but that they could be considered an in-kind replacement like we do with other elements of buildings that have been replaced. So I thought that was a really great idea. Thank you, Melanie. Okay, so my thesis applies my proposed heritage species concept to 2 landscapes and then also evaluates them under the National Register. So I only have time to talk about one of these, so I'm talking about bats. And these photos here are of Mexican free-tailed bats under the Congress Avenue Bridge in Austin, Texas, which I went to last year. Oops, I do have a video here, and we'll see if this works. It's very short. I don't know if anyone's had the pleasure of viewing these bats, but I was on a kayak and I was right underneath them. Not a good place to be. I'll let you imagine why, but there was 1.5 million bats that live under this bridge, and so for like 20 minutes, they're just like, it's crazy coming out of this bridge. So when I visited this site, I was like, wow, I just wonder what a preservationist would think about this bridge, like how would they document it? Would the bats be included as a character-defining feature, maybe a contributing resource, or maybe they would be ignored? And I think obviously a preservationist as a historian would come across all these newspaper articles about the bats, but would the bats really be central or kind of just off to the side? And would their scientific name be in the documentation? Like, I don't know. So the story with these bats, though, are that they moved underneath this bridge, the Congress Avenue Bridge, in the 1980s, and the Congress Avenue Bridge was built in 1909, but it was renovated in the 80s with these 1.5-inch slits that you can kind of see in the photo on the left. Oops, this is playing again. So with these slits, the bats moved in. So they moved from the buildings that they had been living in since the 60s, and they moved underneath this bridge, and they've been there ever since, so quite a long time. So, and at first everyone was terrified of these bats. They get a bad bat rap. They were villainized. Rabies was a huge concern. People are terrified. And it really was this one conservationist named Merlin Tuttle, who's still alive today, I believe, turned the story around, and throughout the decades, soon the bats became a city cultural icon. So Austin is not just bachelorette parties, which is what I thought. As soon as I got into an Uber, someone was like, "Have you seen the bats?" And I was like, "What?" And this is not to mention that the entire time that people were scared of these bats, they were performing an essential ecosystem service for us by keeping the insect populations in check, and now they're supporting a whole tourism industry, which is now negatively impacting the bats to some extent. So anyways, my thesis concludes that yes, bats would be considered a heritage species, fitting into several of the proposed criteria, and then I found this site potentially eligible for the National Register as well, arguing it could be listed under criteria A in the area of conservation, and that it retains integrity of location, setting, feeling, and association. Although I do recognize that this site would be less than 50 years of age, so that criteria G comes into effect. And I don't know if this site constitutes as a site of exceptional significance without really talking to more community members, but I bet the bats would say yes. So my thesis then puts forth several additional candidate categories and example species that could be studied further. And there's too many to honestly name here, but it includes animals beyond just the iconic bald eagles and bison. So you got common species, protected, extinct, nuisance, large predator species, contentious histories. So things like American oysters, raccoons, fireflies, monarch butterflies, saguaro cacti, beaver, cougar, alligators or red wolves that have recently been reintroduced into North Carolina. It's the last remaining population. Alligators, I was recently reading an article that was talking about how they are the original architects of Floridian wetlands over the last 1,000 years. So it's kind of interesting thinking about alligators as architects, but there you have it. Certainly there's other categories not mentioned here, like there's domesticated species or sacred species or species related to indigenous peoples as well, or other types of cultures. So I think these categories should be expanded and just continued to be researched. So if anyone wants to pay me to research species, travel across the United States, let me know. Doubtful, but okay, so this overwhelming figure is goes back to the original part of the goal of heritage species that wants to focus on this holistic view of landscapes, to view them as a system. And I think this figure by the USDA is a great example. It shows how the greater sage grouse, which is this chicken-like bird at the top with the cool tail, supports over 350 species, including humans, and the sagebrush community that ranchers rely on for survival. So this figure is just a really good reminder that people, species, and places are all connected, and I think they should be considered together to have a full understanding of places. And I think really what's missing here is the historical context and how that might help us better understand what has happened in the past and plan for these spaces in the future. And so my thesis also puts forth actionable options, because you might be sitting there asking yourself, okay, great, what do you actually want me to do with this information? And that's a great question. Let me answer that for you. So I have 5 options that I put forth, and so the first is do nothing. So we don't want to do that. And then options 2 through 5 have these varying degrees of how much to integrate species within documentation, because I don't want to scare off anybody. So, and by documentation, again, I'm really just focusing on the National Register nominations, cultural landscape inventories, and cultural landscape reports, because I can't tackle everything. And to make these options kind of more brief, option 2 really just says we should integrate species within documentation. And by this, I mean just include discussions of species within historic contexts and physical histories of places. Or when you're doing archival research, open that folder that says squirrels or rabbits or whatever, and just investigate how people have related to these species and how they have changed the physical environment as well. And options 3 or 4 are somewhat similar, and push this a bit further and say, well, maybe we actually include the term heritage species to identify species as character-defining features or contributing resources. For example, within a cultural landscape inventory, this means pulling out a specific tree or even a forest as a contributing resource, rather than just mentioning it in the physical history section. So there's kind of some options there. And lastly, option 5 is heritage species habitat. So this option exists because I recognize the difficulty in a SHPO accepting listing of a cow to a National Register as an object, for example. So, but I still think it's possible to focus instead on the habitat or the landscape, which fits better into our place-based framework. And I think the best thing about these actions is that you can start thinking and doing this today with option 2, so there's no need for any new fancy terms that people don't know what they are yet. You can simply just incorporate a nature lens when viewing a place or a landscape and start thinking about those animals or vegetation more closely. And my thesis, of course, has some very specific recommendations to update National Park Service guidance. So I suggest adding a new landscape characteristic called heritage species habitat. And then I also suggest adding a new landscape, cultural landscape type called ethnobiological landscape. And something I didn't mention before was the NPS lays out 4 different types of cultural landscapes, including historic, vernacular. Is that for me? Or? Oh, it is? Okay. Do I have any time, or is that it? 2 minutes. All right. Okay. Well, I integrate these into National Park Service guidelines, like the Guide to Cultural Landscape Reports, which NPS employees told me that is their Bible, and so I have specific locations to put these in. You know, I love thinking about the implications, especially in Section 106 and NEPA. I don't really have time to talk about any of these examples now, but maybe in the questions we can, because I think that's actually where I started with this thesis, was thinking about, well, people should have a voice to protect their culturally significant species. And right now, NEPA doesn't really do that, and Section 106 doesn't either. There's also implications on the conservation biology side. The U.S. Geological Survey Gap Analysis Project, I think, is the most interesting project because it asks how well are we protecting common plants and animals, and that aligns so well in preservation with the protection of more common spaces. Like, if you think about a common park that's really important to a community, well, there's also common species like rabbits or squirrels that are really entrenched in the sustainability of that park as well. And there's a couple other implications as well that we can talk about later. But ultimately, final thoughts include there's many other future areas of study. I really want to focus on sort of an environmental justice sphere, the integration of traditional ecological knowledge and indigenous knowledge, especially talking about, okay, now you have a species listed on the National Register. What is a cultural resource manager at the Park Service supposed to do with that? There are no treatment recommendations for that, so that needs to be developed as well. And this matters now because basically our wildlife within the United States faces an elevated risk of extinction. There's 1 million plant and animal species now that are threatened with extinction. There's legislation stalled in the Senate that's trying to revitalize and protect our species, but they clearly need some focus, and I think historic preservation can play a role in that. And lastly, if I can leave you with anything, it's this quote from a book about animal studies and the history of Seattle, which just says that we think of cities and we think of a lot of places as just human landscapes, but I think that the cities and farmhouses and industrial sites and historic cemeteries are really more than human. So thank you.
Questions for Liz?
I was wondering if you've seen any involvement of protecting animal species as part of advocacy for protecting historic sites. It just occurred to me that the other day a person was talking about the view shed across the Chesapeake from Annapolis, and how, as we're trying to look at climate mitigation, we're thinking of wind turbines and other sources of energy. And obviously, how are we going to sacrifice some of these view sheds for that type of concern? So I was just thinking that recognizing the potential threat to wildlife, the migrating birds, the Chesapeake is a major flyway, could be an aspect of this advocacy work. So have you seen this happening in other parts of the country, or?
Yeah, I think there is overlap, especially when you consider like the legal side, like NEPA, like especially the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. But I think those acts and legislation tend to protect species more on the ecological side, which is kind of like why I'm arguing that it should be integrated with the National Historic Preservation Act, so people have a voice, because they, not so much that it's an endangered species or migratory birds, which birds kind of get a special classification in the United States, but that they have this cultural attachment to it. So I think many people would say, like, oh, we already have so many protections for species, and that is true. But then you have these spaces where, there are species that don't have protections that people still hold value to. And so, I would also advocate for like preservation organizations and environmental organizations to work closer together, especially when you're just thinking about a historic district, like an urban historic district, and having a cleanup, which I know the L'Enfant Trust, who Katie is here today, you guys had a cleanup with an environmental organization, so that's a great example of a preservation organization working with an environmental one. So there's so much crossover, so good question.
So I was thinking as you were talking about kind of linking back to Tim's comment earlier about making change more easily as conditions change, and we think of that maybe with social aspects or the built environment, but species, especially in the coming years, will have likely a lot of displacement and movement. And so I was just, I don't know if this is a comment or a question, but thinking about kind of tying those two things together, or maybe the importance of having some kind of fluid process for change in the coming years to keep things from being outdated, and also, another kind of, we think of place attachment with people, but also what that's going to look like in your framework, people's attachment to species and those movements and what it does to their place as those things happen. So
yeah, I think that's a great question. I don't know if I have a great answer, but I will say that one of the books I read was an author called Peter Alagana, who talks about, his book is called Accidental Ecosystem, and it's just about basically the influences of climate change and things like increased construction and development, which is pushing species together with people. So it's just exacerbating this issue. And anytime you have like raccoons or bears or large predator species especially are creating problems, and we really need to figure out what we're going to do about that. So you're right, there's this continuing change, and I think it's going to get worse as climate change and development increases. And we can't just resort to killing off animals. I think there are other solutions that we can try as well. And it's, again, goes back to getting over our human exceptionalism and maybe thinking about, okay, let's think about these species more ethically. And that's what I would like to see happen. So I don't know if that answers your question, but.
All right, thank you, Liz.
You're welcome.